All right, everyone, let's do the Dharma opening verse. The unsurpassed, profound, and wondrous Dharma is rarely met with, even in 100,000 million kalpas. Now we can see and hear it, accept and maintain it. May we unfold the meaning of the Tathagata's truth. So again, greetings everyone. Welcome to what we call our first Zazenkai, and it's of course of 2021. So I always like to make a point of that because I think we always need to work on renewing ourselves, and taking opportunity to reaffirm our practice, reaffirm our commitment to our practice, continue practicing, So, so I like to really have that front and center as we approach a new year. I remember back in Chicago at the Zen Buddhist Temple of Chicago, we'd often get a lot of new people, in January. We have people, New Year's resolutions and what have you. And so I think this is good. I think we all need to reaffirm and make that kind of resolve and resolution in our practice as we go along. So anyway, today, somebody keep me honest on time, if you would, keep me posted. But I want to talk about one of our great teachers, Mahapachapati. We did a little bit of a dedication in our midday service today. So I want to talk a little bit about her and her contribution. Many of you may know a bit about this. Some of you may not. It's wonderful. I think it's really good, wonderful information about Buddhism, and adds a lot of depth and breadth to our understanding, I think, of Buddhism and Buddhist teaching. I also want to talk a little bit, hopefully we'll have a time, I want to talk a little bit about some of the teachings that the historical Buddha was doing in the early part of his career, about the time that Mahapachapati came along. So that's why 7 Factors of Awakening, I've listed that as well. It's pretty indicative of the kinds of things that the Buddha was helping people with and teaching. So let's see. So if we talk about Mahapachapati, her name was Pajapati. Maha means great. So she earned that name as she got older, and you'll see why. But to go right back to the beginning to help understand who she was the sister of Maya, and they both had married King Sododana, who was the Shakya clan king, and he was also the father with Maya of Siddhartha to become the Buddha. So that's kind of the makeup, Pajapati was sister of Maya, who was the queen. Maya was the older sister, and she was the first, and but also Pajapati was another wife of that king of Sododana. But what happened was, as the pregnancy ensued, the Buddha was soon to be born, and was born, on, we usually say that, Buddha was born in, in the spring. Hanamatsuri is a festival that we have in the April-May timeframe, which marks that. Well, everything, I won't go into those details. We talked about that a bit when we talked about the historical Buddha in December and his awakening experience. Well, what happens is that 7 days after the Buddha is born, his mother, Maya, dies. So we don't know much about that. We don't have hardly any details. We can just imagine that some complication with childbirth couldn't be overcome, and she died. And so Pajapati, as the second wife, fills in and becomes Siddhartha's stepmother. And she had a son of her own as well. His name is Nanda. So she raised both of those children together. So kind of an interesting story that we don't always know about. And so everything moves along. I won't go into any stories about his upbringing, but just to know that Pajapati stepped in and really was his mother. She took care of him from a baby all the way until the time when he decided to leave the palace and try to understand, why do people suffer? What is the nature of suffering? Let me get some insights that I can share with all beings. Well, it probably comes as no surprise that when the Buddha left the palace, when he left the palace in the middle of the night in order to find out why people suffer, and it's a wonderful story. We're all very inspired by his dedication and all this, but no surprise, some people didn't feel that way about it, and of course his wife, his son, Pajapati was not thrilled that, Siddhartha takes off. And he is gone for 5 or 6 years on his quest. And ultimately, he has an awakening and he begins to teach. And he is very effective. He has a following that grows by the day. And so what happens here is, I think, very interesting. What's happening is a lot of people meet the Buddha, they hear him speak, and right away they want to become followers. They want to join the monastic order, which is only men. And so little by little, many people join the monastic order. For example, Rahula, which is the Buddha's son, Nanda, which is Pajapati's other son, even King Sododana, though he doesn't join the monastery, but he becomes a follower. And so we have a lot of people becoming monastics under this new order, men, and we have a lot of followers who are men and women who are more of a lay practice. And so this is quite an interesting phenomenon. What we start to see happening is more and more women are without a husband because they've either gone to the monastery, follow the Buddha. On top of this, at this time, there was a civil war between the Shakya tribe and the tribe that Pajapati's was from, which is the Kolia tribe. There was a water rights issue and a war broke out, and a lot of men were killed. And so we have a lot of women from that experience, they are converting over and following the Buddha. A third factor is there were a lot of women that were disenfranchised when Siddhartha went on his quest, that were part of what we would call a harem. He had a lot of women in the palace to take care of him and this kind of thing. So little by little, there were a lot of women who were disenfranchised. Remember, back in that day, women were of a lower, their capabilities to own property, to do a lot of things were restricted by the culture. And even as you look now into the Middle East, we see still women can't go places without an accompaniment from a brother or a father, something like that. Well, this was very much the same case in Buddhist time. And so these women were in bad shape in terms of what were they going to do. And many of these women were very inspired by the Buddha also. And so little by little, these women started coming to Pajapati because she was the mother of the Buddha. So she has a special connection and maybe opening with the Buddha, but they come to her for help. What should we do? And these kinds of things. And ultimately, it percolates to the point where Pajapati herself wants to become part of the monastic order. So famously, she goes to see the Buddha herself at Kapilavastu, and she asked him 3 times. She tells him, we think it's, that women should also be part of the order. Why can't we be part of the order? And his basic refrain in answering was, don't set your heart on this. So, all we can understand is that the culture of the times would have made this very challenging. And the Buddha resisted doing this because he was concerned that it might damage the work that's already been going on and the order that's already been established with men. Something of this sort. So he refused his mother's request, stepmother's request. So then he goes to Jetavana a few weeks later, and ultimately Pajapati and 500 women, they shave their heads, they don a golden monastic robes, and they walk what evidently was 357 miles from Kapilavastu to Jetavana in a march. And I don't know how long it took. I'm sure it took quite a while. It was an amazing effort. I don't know if anything like that had ever happened before in that area or in those times. And people were so impressed by this that, people were lining the road to witness this amazing event. Well, they get to Jetavana, and Ananda is Pajapati's nephew, so family. And so Ananda sees Pajapati coming with 500 women, and they're all exhausted. They're all, really beat, and Pajapati is beat. So finally, he goes to see his aunt when she arrives, and Pajapati is weeping. And he said, I guess he says, is there a revolt? Is there a calamity? I don't think he understands why they are there. And he's shocked, and everybody is. So Ananda, who is, we know, the Buddha's assistant, very important figure. He goes to the Buddha and 3 times asks the Buddha, and each time he tells Ananda, don't set your heart on this. And so finally, Ananda's pretty clever. He's a very intelligent person. So finally he says to the Buddha, he says, Buddha, is it possible for a woman to attain Buddhahood? He asks Ananda asked the Buddha. Buddha said a woman could attain it as well as a man. And then once he admitted this, I think, who knows exactly what transpired, but he had to admit no difference between men and women in terms of waking up to their true nature. And with that, I think the Buddha himself could not deny. And so this is exactly what happened. He agreed to start a woman monastic order. And there were 8 conditions that were prescribed on women. So the good news is the women's order began. The bad news is, if you want to look at it in these sort of terms, is that he shackled to some degree women with a secondary responsibility under men, so that men still had to pretty much oversee the activities, make sure everything was going okay, and like that. We can go into the details of that. I have a list of those, but it is something that you wouldn't probably agree to unless you had no alternative. And that's exactly what was the situation with Pachapati. She said, nonetheless, we'll get started and we will do this. And so that's really how it's a kind of a short version of how the women monastic order began. I want to read a couple of things to you to help give a little more flavor of it. This is about Pachapati becoming awakened later in her career. It says, upon ordination, in this monastic, she received a subject of meditation. So the Buddha gave her something to meditate upon, and through it was able to realize perfection. She writes, I have reached the state where everything stops. This is nirvana, the extinction of senses, feelings, consciousness. This achievement is synonymous with nirvana, the highest attainment. And a couple more things I'll share with you. And this is some commentary from a wonderful book. If you're interested in the subject, this is a really good book. First Buddhist Women. It chronicles a number of women. Most of those women, if not all of them, are some of the writers of a collection of poems called Therigatha. It's called Therigatha. And so in this book, the author takes those individuals, and in some cases, she has some history about them. And she puts those together with the poems. The poems are Enlightenment poems from the women in that monastic order from the very beginning, during the Buddha's time. So it's quite an interesting, collection of poems, quite special. Especially when you think about this is, I guess a couple things I'll stop and say at the moment is that, this is 500 years BC, and to have a collection of women's writings that were kept in the collection of sutras and the Buddhist canon all these years, is pretty miraculous in many, many regards. The other thing to think about when we look at this story, and we need to probably go into it more deeply to really start thinking about it deeply. But when we think about, on the one hand, we have a women's order began in Buddhism. And on the other hand, we still have some of the prejudicial things from the culture that we didn't get away from. I think when you compare that to what happened in Buddhism, this is in Buddhism 2,500 years ago, and this was actually when the founder of that faith is still alive. When you compare that to other religions that, maybe came along a little later even, women were not part of the clergy, still even in some cases to this day. So I think that backdrop is somewhat helpful. I think it's miraculous in a way that this change happened and women were embraced in Buddhist, uh, um, within the order when the Buddha is still alive is quite miraculous. And I think it's very important. But here's another comment. This is a story about Mahapachapati toward the end. At the ripe age of 120, oh yeah, and she lives to be 120. So even though she's Buddha's stepmother, she outlives him, and she lives to be 120. Pachapati knew that her time of death was near, though it was against monastic regulations that a sick nun be visited by any monk. This is part of those list of 8 regulations. Pachapati requested that her former son come to her. So she asked for the Buddha. And by going, the Buddha in effect changed the rule. When she died, miracles occurred both then and at her cremation, miracles which later were said to have been equaled only by those of the Buddha himself. Clearly, the early Sangha judged Pachapati as a remarkable person. When we consider Pachapati and her sister Maya, whom Pachapati mentions in the closing stanza of a poem which I'll read to you, as she refers to her as the great mother, in the Buddhist tradition, for Maya, mother of the Buddha, this is an obvious delineation, but it is equally appropriate description of Pachapati, who through countless lives had come to be known all relations, mother, son, father, brother, grandmother. Mahapachapati Gautama is clearly an old soul. She contains within herself the breadth of experience that makes her the appropriate founding mother of Buddhism. So here is a poem that she wrote. And this gives you just a little taste of some of the poems that are contained in the Theragatha collection. Here's what Pachapati says. Homage to you, Buddha, best of all creatures, who set me and many others free from pain. All pain is understood, the cause, the craving is dried up, the noble eightfold way unfolds. I have reached the state where everything stops. I have been mother, son, father, brother, grandmother, knowing nothing of the truth, I journeyed on. So this just, throughout all of her lives, she's been all of these things. She journeyed on to find the truth. But I have seen the Blessed One now. This is my last body, and I will not go from birth to birth again. Look at the disciples all together, their energy, their source, and sincere effort. This is homage to the Buddhas. Maya gave birth to Gautama for the sake of all. She has driven back the pain of sick and the dying. So anyway, very nice, I think, poem and a little capturing of some sentiment there. How are we doing for time?
We've got plenty.
How much?
It's 3:08, so.
Okay. So anyway, I'm curious to see if anyone has comments or questions or anything about that before we maybe talk about some of the teachings I wanted to share. Were you all familiar with that story? If you were or were not? Okay, good. I think I know many of you are, but I do think it's always nice to reaffirm, reacquaint ourselves with what those from the past have brought and what they contributed, and to encourage us in our efforts. Okay, anything? Yes. Yes, Janice. Jisho.
Yes, it's really fitting actually that I joined Sawyer for today as his mother. So I can really understand better. I didn't know that whole story. And hearing the persistence and the faith that Buddha's mother had, I think she knew she could finally convince him at some point, and she just kept going. And that's what women do. We endure and we continue, and even if things are very difficult. And mothers have such a special relationship with their children. And so it's just kind of amazing to think back then in 500 BC, that kind of a relationship gave us what it gave us.
Yeah. There is a little more information if you look at it a little bit about the dialogue between Ananda and the Buddha, which is it's pretty interesting. He basically goes to the Buddha and said, do you realize that your mother is out here and she's weeping and she's dusty and exhausted and this kind of thing? Because I think Ananda himself he doesn't know what to do. He's like, we got to do something here, Buddha. Let's do something. And so obviously Ananda was, he's celebrated as having made a nice contribution for women, to help Buddha come to this conclusion himself, and move forward. So a good story. Yes, Fusatsu.
Yeah, and Janice, thank you so much for your comments about that. And I think this is really, I'm always looking forward to bringing the teachings into the now. And what a great week to be talking about this women's, continued, journey, and the recognition of that as women continue to work to obtain, certain levels in our government, and just across the board. So Sensei, I just had to put that plug in there because this was a wonderful kind of parallel for as the teaching always is, if we're really paying attention to the current events of the continued process of moving forward. So I just had to put a shout out for that, since that was a current event from the past week.
Great. Yes, thank you for bringing that up, for sure. Most important. And so we can see the long arc of history, right? As we know. Yes, Walter.
You said earlier about how the women were oppressed back then because of the culture and that they didn't have equal rights, but women were considered possessions in America until the beginning of the 20th century. So it was still that way 2,500 years after the Buddha, which I think is a damn shame.
Yes, I so agree. Thank you for that. The work hasn't ended. We have much more to do. But what I celebrate is the fact that if you look at Soto Zen Buddhism, for example, across this country, I think you're going to find more women priests than men priests now. At least the numbers are very similar, are very close. And when I go to SZBA meetings of teachers around the country, there are more women there than men typically. And so I see that as a beautiful sign, and more progress is being made. But yes, work needs to be done, but we are seeing progress in front of our very eyes. And so I think that's wonderful. And you can look at this story of the Buddha, you can say the glass is half full or it's half empty, certainly depending on how you want to look at it. But I certainly like, given the time that this happened, I say the glass is half full. And as we go along, it's getting fuller and fuller. And so anyway, thank you guys for your comments. Anybody else? Yes, Myosho.
I think that for me, it's interesting. When the Buddha decided to become a monk, he just took off. And when Mahapachapati, when she decided to become a nun, she took everyone with her. And there's a very, very distinct difference in somebody that can go away and say, well, I'm going to go practice, and somebody that says, I'm going to take all my responsibilities with me and practice. Not to mean that the Buddha didn't later take on responsibilities, but I think that that's a very different way of living and a very different practice. We don't know about their children. These women who lost their husbands and lived in the harem, lived in the palace, we don't know who else they took with them. We also hear about Mahapachapati in terms of the Buddha. And we do a lot of his disciples, but I think it would be interesting to hear about Mahapachapati and how she was as a person and as a woman with the women that she worked with.
Yeah.
There is a book coming out supposedly this spring that's supposed to be more in detail about her. But I also, when I look at her and we look at what they called her a Buddha. They named her a Buddha in the Therigatha. And they gave her, I can't remember which one of them was Gautami and one of them was Gautama, but they gave her that name and it's never been mentioned again. And I can't understand how men in that era that considered women possessions would ever call a woman that unless she had achieved that status. Not in that day and age. And so I think it's very interesting also that we've forgotten that. And it's good that this is coming out as an honorific this year about her. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks for all your comments. I appreciate that very much. What I would say is, to your first point, obviously, the Buddha didn't have anything to share. So he left so that he could find the answer that he could share. So obviously, what is kindness? I think it's important to look at, it's very kind. Is it kind to give the person what they want? Or is it more kind to give them what they need? That kind of an idea. So, I mean, the Buddha, I think, given his life in the palace, that was kind of a status quo. What he was looking to do was to help all beings. So he left so he could try to figure that out by himself. Then he brought it back, 5-6 years later, and everybody else now could benefit from what he was able to bring back. So I think that's an important part. And even Pajapati was very thankful that the Buddha brought that back so that she could grow from it and she could help others likewise. But, you know, even in this book that I pointed out, it's got some of Pachapati's students' poems and stories. And yes, I so agree, you know, Sho, they are so complimentary of Pachapati, her skills, her ability to speak the truth and help people overcome their own self-centeredness. So, but there has been, I think, over what, 5 to 10 years, more and more of a flowering about this information. The Therigatha hasn't been always well known, and more recently we're getting better translations of it, and we're getting authors who are really bringing out the stories from behind the poems. So Yosho, I'm really glad to hear that a new book's coming out. Thank you. Tesen.
Yeah, just a very short comment, because as we're talking about this, I recall a conversation with Matsuoka Roshi. Now, almost 30 years ago, and I had a question: is there a difference between having a male disciple and a female disciple? And he said, no, absolutely none whatsoever. Is the only difference is the male disciple can continue the discussion going into the bathroom. Only difference.
Gotcha.
But I mean, here the founder of our order, you know, from the beginning, I think has this same attitude of the complete equality between men and women. And I just hadn't framed it that way until this discussion. So thank you to all.
Yeah.
One more thing I'd like to say is men and women, you know, there's the story of the Mahasiddhas that went out into the graveyards and meditated. I think Buddha may have done that too.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was this tradition of people going off and finding by themselves. But my point about Mahapachapati is that I think her enlightenment came through her identification and her care of these people, which was entirely different than the approach of the traditional approach.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's one of the characteristics about her, is I think it came through her recognized care and her concern for others. And we had not seen that in this tradition and this traditions of yogic traditions. And so I'm just saying that's very, very different.
Yeah, I think, you know, Yosho, I think you're talking about Sangha practice, you know,
Yes.
what we call Sangha practice now, you know, and I agree with you. I think Pachapati was a wonderful, I think she was very skilled at working with people, helping people. And so that was a very strong suit. And so I think that was a wonderful avenue for her to teach. And, but, you know, the Buddha also founded the Sangha for that same purpose. But I hear what you're saying. I think it's a very good point. Anything else? Appreciate that discussion very much. What I wanted to say, we don't have a lot of time left, but I wanted to make a note about, mention about a teaching called the 7 Factors of Awakening. And I bring this up because in the Buddha's early teaching career, he focused on how do we calm our minds? You know, how do we settle the mind? So that he couldn't teach esoteric or difficult principles to people when our minds are all stirred up and we're having all kinds of troubles and all kinds of self-centeredness. So one of the teachings that he did early on was, it's known as the Anapanasati, but it's also in English that means Sutra on the Full Awareness of Breathing. So he gave a talk and a teaching just on how to fully be aware of the breath. So again, a very, very important teaching on how to calm, how to look clearly at this moment and let the mind settle. Part of that teaching, he brings up this idea of the 7 factors of awakening. And I think I'll just give you a high level on this today, and then maybe this will be a topic that I'll dwell on more in the coming Zazenkais. But the 7 factors are these. And we can think of these as, these are factors that if cultivated, and how do we cultivate these? Through our meditation practice. This isn't something aside from Zazen. This is in keeping and is one with our Zazen practice. And I think you'll see that as we go through. But the first one is cultivating mindfulness. Okay, so this seems, sometimes we'll say Zazen is mindfulness, and it is, but Zazen is, I think, much more. And let's see what this tells us about that. So mindfulness to maintain awareness of reality. What is really going on right now? For me to understand that deeply, I need to get my story out of the way, my monkey mind business out of the way. Number 2, investigation of the nature of reality. So it's one thing to be aware of reality, understanding it more deeply, that's what investigation is. Energy, having energy in our practice. This includes determination, effort, our enthusiasm for practice. This is a very important element. If we lose our enthusiasm, our energy for practice, we can't sustain it. Number 4 is joy. I think this is really interesting myself, because the Buddha taught these. Joy is something that, the Buddha says, joy comes from making a complete effort. And when I've thought about that a little bit, and I think we can sort of see that connection. But when you've done a lot, when you've made a big effort, and there's a certain joy that wells up in us, that we know we've done our best, we've done all we can, not that we won't do more, but there's an inherent joy that I think wells up when we are following the right path, we are doing the right thing. So I think this is the point about joy. Number 5 is relaxation or tranquility of both body and mind. Don't cultivate stress. Don't hang on to worry and all kinds of the negativity that keeps dragging us down. This is relaxation, de-stressing. Concentration is number 6, a calm, one-pointed state of mind or clear awareness. Concentration is necessary for us to be mindful. Without concentration, mindfulness is going to always elude us. The mind is just going to keep bouncing around, and we all experience this, we know about this, but through effort, through concentration, cultivation, our mindfulness gets deeper and deeper. And the last one is equanimity. So to accept reality as it is without craving or aversion. Equanimity is seeing things the way it is. And first of all, embracing it, seeing it. And I think seeing it and embracing it's the same thing is what I'm saying. And so once we see something clearly, then we can take the appropriate action that may need to happen to take care of it. But if we don't see things clearly, if we see things from a self-centered standpoint, we're going to have a distorted view of the reality, and our actions will be distorted likewise. So, so these are the 7 factors that the Buddha talks about at some length. And so this is very important, you know, and with this, there from another sutra where he talks about it again, he says the factors of enlightenment, in what sense are they called factors of enlightenment? And the Buddha replied, they lead to enlightenment. Therefore, they are called factors of awakening or enlightenment. So cultivating these factors lead us to our awakening. So I like to look at them. A couple of things I want to say about this before we end. That is, I think all of these attributes are part of our true nature. And so we've done a lot of effort to superimpose self-centeredness over our own true nature, our own Buddha nature. And so many of these elements are being masked over and we don't see them. But I think as we cultivate them and let go of self-centeredness and all the negativity that come from greed, hate, and delusion, the 3 poisons, keep letting go. These emerge as what is in fact our true nature. So I think the Buddha is just pointing out these are factors of our awakening because these are who we are. And so anyway, I want to share these with you. I think it's a really interesting list, and I think it's encouraging. And I think it should encourage us in our Zazen practice. And we should bring these qualities and this practice into our Zazen. Equanimity, no matter what object arises in our mind. Understand, this is an object, be aware of it, but let it go. Just see things the way they are. If things come up that you might say, I don't like, just be aware of it and let it go. If we wrestle with not liking it, we're encouraging it to stay and get stronger. So little by little, equanimity, you know, our energy, continuing to challenge ourselves to get up and practice every day, and deepen our practice, and all of these things. Work on them in your Zazen practice. So any comments or thoughts about that? And again, much more I can say, but for now, that's where we'll leave it. But these are the kinds of things that the Buddha was teaching at the early part of his career when, you know, the orders were being established, even though the men order of monks came first, the nuns, I don't know exactly how much longer after, but some time, still in his early part of his career, was established. So, so very good, you guys. Anything else before we wrap it up with the 4 great vows?
Just a request, maybe in the future, maybe yourself or some of our senior students can take each one of these and have a discussion. I think that would be great. It's a lot packed into these 7. So if maybe in the future we can have like a series or something on them. So Gasha, thank you for your teaching, Sensei.
Great idea. Thank you, Fusatsu. All right, everybody. Any other comments? Wonderful. All right. Let's end with the 4 great vows, and then we'll have 2 more periods of Zazen. Really enjoyed practicing together, everyone. Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize it. Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize it. Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize it. Very good.